So welcome to my session. I'm Martha Zink. I'm going to talk about flexible reporting, and we're going to talk a lot about virtual lists and ExecuteSQL. All right, so who am I? Those are my kids. I have to post them, of course. I am a technical project lead for Soliant Consulting. I counted, this is my 11th DevCon, which is really exciting, and it's the third time I've spoken at DevCon. I love to problem solve. I am happy to talk about the Oxford comma for hours on end, and I think everything, see, that's what I wanted. That's what I like. And I like lists of 3. I'm going to try really hard not to talk as fast as I always do. I was recently told that when people watch my YouTube videos, they don't 1.5 me, but they do everyone else. So you might have to go the other way if YouTube lets you. The agenda is really straightforward. We're going to talk about virtual lists, we're going to talk about ExecuteSQL, and then we're going to talk about what you can do with those 2 things together. This is a weird topic in that there's a lot you can do with it. And the examples that I have are just the ones that come to my mind, things that I've experienced and things that have worked for me. There's a lot of variability here, and if you want to share your stories with me, I would love to hear how else you've been using it. So just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going to end up, I wanted to show you what this virtual list ExecuteSQL thing I came up with in the end looks like. I've got a couple of examples, and this one is kind of like a pivot table, right? So in FileMaker, pivoting data is not easy. But a virtual list is a great way of doing that, and ExecuteSQL is a great way of collecting the data. What you're looking at here is a bunch of expense data, so imagine that you have a bunch of sales reps and they're trying to keep your clients happy, so they're going to take them to Texans games, not Cowboys games. They're going to take them to, go out to dinner, go out dining. Oh, did I hear a boo somewhere? But you want to be able to see, where sales reps are taking the clients, where the money's going. So instead of just looking at your data in a more traditional FileMaker format where you're going to see things going down, here we're pivoting the data. So you're looking at sales rep by category, but then you're also seeing sales rep by client, and it goes further than that, which we'll go through. My goal is to show you this at the end, but we're going to kind of build up to there. So here are the caveats about this presentation. You have used the tools before to create a virtual list. It's not that scary, and that's what I want everyone in this room to feel. By the end of it, they should be able to create a virtual list or feel like they can do it. It's doable, and it's magical, and that's what we're aiming for. ExecuteSQL is a lot like FileMaker, but it is a different language. So that one's a little bit trickier, but hopefully we can break it down well enough that you'll be able to interpret and understand how you can use it, and then baby steps, but it's definitely a great building block. And you can do this. It's going to be really exciting. And the first time you create your virtual list, ExecuteSQL thing, you're going to spin in your chair, you're going to air pump, you're going to do something, and it's going to feel really great. And I still do it to this day. And we are going to start simple and go to complex. So for those who have already done virtual lists or ExecuteSQL, if you stick around till the end, hopefully you'll get some cool ideas on how to implement these things. So I am going to start with virtual lists by themselves. So what is a virtual list? It's a FileMaker table. It has FileMaker fields, and it has FileMaker records. One of the weird things about a virtual list is when you think virtual, you think it just kind of doesn't probably use much FileMaker stuff, but it actually uses all the FileMaker stuff. Where the magic happens is that the data is stored locally. And that's the most important thing, and that's what makes this really exciting. Instead of the data living in your normal file, you're storing your data in local memory for each user. So 2 people, 3 people, 10 people, 100 people could be looking at the same report in concept, and they could be cutting up the data in a completely different way. You use virtual lists usually against a global field or a global variable. So how does it work? You start with a blob of data. So here's my blob. Now, traditionally what you're going to look for is a return delimited array of information. So here we've just got 4 values in a row. Then you have a table with fields in FileMaker. Now you're going to have 2 fields at minimum. The first field is going to tell you which row of the data you care about. And you're going to hard code that. So every record will have a number attached to it, starting with 1 and then just being a serial number. Then you're going to use a calculation to look at the array to know what data you want to show. So because you're looking at row 1 of the data, you go to the blob and you say that's Apple, and it's going to pull that into the calculation. So you've got a hard-coded field, and then you've got a calculation that uses that hard-coded field to know where to look in the data. You can parse data horizontally, and this is where a lot of the magic happens with virtual lists. So what if I had multiple pieces of data all smushed together in my data blob? Well, now, let's say that this is your grocery list. You need 5 apples and 3 bananas and so on. What can you do there? You're going to follow a very similar pattern here, which is you're going to have, again, that field that tells you what row of the data you care about, and then you can pull multiple pieces of information. This is really a game of manipulating data and parsing out data, and FileMaker is really good at that. Humans are really good at that too, so I challenge you to think about how you would do it if you were the machine, right? How would you think through this? And if I told you that that was 5 apples, you know that, and you can translate that because you see that pipe in there, right? So you assume, oh, those are two values, right? And with FileMaker, you can do the same thing. So what you end up doing is you end up substituting that with returns, and now you've got a little mini array. You've got apple return 5, and I'll show you a demo of this in a little bit. So then you can have a separate field for the data that you want. Okay, so why virtual lists? They're flexible, they're user-specific. It's a great way to take a blob of data that you got from somewhere and manipulate it. And it's really same tools, but a different way. So you'll be familiar with the techniques or what you can do. All right, so let me open up one of my files here. So this is a super simple file. It doesn't have much meat to it at the moment. So it's got a single global field, which is where I'm going to put my blob of data. Okay? Now, when we get to the ExecuteSQL, we'll talk about how we're going to collect that blob and what we're going to do. Let's, for now, just pretend that we've got a blob. It's a very technical term, by the way. And then I've got just a table called VL for virtual list. It has no fields in it. Well, that's what we're going to build here on the fly. And the reason I decided to build this on stage is because I want to prove that it's a very doable thing. So the first thing I said we needed was a field, and I like to call it row. You can call it record number, you can call it unique number, you can call it a lot of things. I like row because when I think of an array, I think of what row of data I'm getting, so it just correlates well in my brain that way. It's going to be a number field, and I'm going to go ahead and make it a serial number, and not allow people to modify it. Make sure that you do not let people delete records in your virtual list, because you're going to have just missing data. And I'm sure I might do it by accident, we'll see. And then the other thing that you need is you need a field that's going to have the actual data. So let's call it the data. And it's going to be a calculation. Now, I told you that you're going to have a blob of data somewhere to reference. So I have a global field for that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say get value from data where the, and then what row do I want? That's the next question, right? How do I know that? I know that from my row field. And we'll make that text. All right, so that's it for now. I've got these 2 fields, my one table. I'm going to open up another window here to show you. All right, so let's add these on here. All right, that's probably kind of tiny, huh? All right, now one thing is you do have to have records to make this work. So I've created a really simple script that's going to loop. It's going to create as many records as I want it to. It's going to create 1,000 here on the fly. So there are my 1,000 records. I see 1,000 numbers because I have 1,000 records, right? I have to have that serial number so that I can look at the data the right way. And it's going to be pretty empty otherwise because I don't have a blob of data yet. So let me grab a blob. We've got some state population data. Now I'm going to refresh the window here. And now you see that it's pulling that information. So how does it know to pull it? Since Alabama is the first row, it pulled that, and then it pulled that very first up to the return, and so on and so forth, right? 2 and 3. If I go down here and move Texas to the top, because that's how Texas feels. If I go in here and now refresh this, you'll see that now Texas is number 1. Because that's the information it has. You are telling me to look at this blob, and you are telling me to look at this record. So that, in concept, is a virtual list. And then here we have one field that has both of the pieces of information, and I probably want to break that out. With a virtual list, you can sort. With a virtual list, you can add calculations. There's a lot that you can do, so you want your data parsed out like you would normally. So I can go in here and create a new field called state name. It's still a calculation. Now, let me get out of here for a second. I told you that FileMaker is really good at parsing out data. But right now I have a pipe for my 2 values. If I switch that to a return, then I have a little mini array, right? My state name and then my population right under it. FileMaker is a rock star at getting any value that I ask it to get. It does way better with a return delimited list. So I'm going to add a substitute around this one. And I'm going to substitute the pipe with a return. So just to show you that, it looks like it's just the first one, but if I click on any of these, you'll see my 2 values, right? There's my little mini array. So for my state name, I can say get value from the data, and I want which value? I want the first record, and that's a text. Now I'm using a global variable, a global field, so FileMaker is going to be smart enough to make this unstored. But you'll notice here that I have to turn this on here because, you'll have to turn it on if you're using a global variable because it needs to be unstored. So we've got that there. And then for my next field, I'll just do amount. And it's going to be very similar, right? So get value, the data, and then I'm getting the second value, right? And let me just double check that's the right kind. So it's a number, it's perfect. All right, so now I've got my 2 fields. I'm going to go ahead and leave that one on the screen just to show it. And then I'll do the state name and the amount. So now, what was in one field in a return delimited array is now in 2 separate fields. And I can go in here and I can search on any of this. So I could say anything, any state that starts with the letter T. It's the Texas thing. So there are the 2 states. I can look for those. I can find anything that has a value, and then I could sort by that. So I could say sort ascending or sort descending. So I can manipulate the data just like I would regular FileMaker data. And what makes this so great is it really is just looking at that blob. So if I go in there and change the blob to blob 2, now we're looking at some average temperatures for every state. And if I refresh the window, now my data changes. That's super flexible, right? With just a change of a single field in this case, or a single variable, which you can use too, the data automatically changes. Now, I mentioned that you can use calculations against this. I didn't want to spend a bunch of time writing up a calc, so I wrote a custom function. So let me add a field here, and it tells you how I feel about weather. And then, so I've got my custom function down here, how do I feel about this temperature? And then it's the amount field, right? That tells me the average temperature there. So I'm going to add that calculation. Again, I'm looking at that amount field, right? So I'm looking at that local data. And then I can go in here, and I can do subsummary parts. So let me add a subsummary by my feelings. My counselor and I are going to have a good time about this one. And then I'm going to add that field on there, and then I'm going to go ahead and sort my data. I can leave the amount in there if I want it. And then you can see how I feel about stuff. So Alaska, absolutely not, because that's crazy, 26 degrees. But basically, I'm messing with data on the fly. I'm getting a lot of information here. I can do subsummaries. I can do summary fields, so I could get totals or averages or counts if I wanted them. Let me pause there for a second on virtual lists. Let me go back to the presentation. We'll come back to that for sure. I think this is a little bit of an odd presentation because I picked 2 very hardy topics to put into one. So you're going to have to just sit on that one for a little bit. It's a little chicken or the egg here. So I keep talking about this famous blob of data. How do you get that blob of data? Well, you can do things like loop through records. You could use a calculation. You could go through a relationship. There are a lot of possibilities on how you collect the data. ExecuteSQL is a fantastic way to collect data. It's totally my new hammer. I use it for everything. So it's a FileMaker function. We're not talking about the script step. That's to pull related data or external data. It's a SQL query, so you're using a select statement. Bob and I can't ever agree if it's SQL or SQL, but I'll let you guys decide. I'll put it on Twitter or MySpace. Is that what you're on, Bob? ExecuteSQL is a data collection tool. We're not manipulating real live data. We're taking that data and we're putting it in a blob and then being able to manipulate it. And it's awesome because it's based off of your table occurrences. It's based off of your relationships graph. And the reason that's important is because if you have external data, whether that's other FileMaker files or you have an external data source, you can use ExecuteSQL against that information. All right, so what does it look like? It's just a lot. This is its own blob of text. It's just code. So you're going to select what fields you want and then from what table. You can do things, and at the bare minimum, you need these 2 pieces. But then you can do things like where. So then you can have some criteria. And all of this very much follows FileMaker terminology or habits. We've got a field. We've got 1 or more fields. We've got tables. 1 or more tables. We can have a where, which tells us what we're searching on. You can do a join to relate two tables, and then you have to quantify or quantify how they're related. And there's a lot more that you can do too, and with the examples I'll show, you'll see a few of those. Why do we use ExecuteSQL? It's impressively fast usually. Now, there are some caveats here for sure. I'm sure there are a lot of people who would love to stand up and share those, because we've all been pained with them. If your fields and your data are stored, so if you have unstored calcs, you're going to run into some speed issues potentially. This is one of those, test your data, test your scripts. But when you have stored data, it's really impressively fast. And it's context agnostic. One of the things that FileMaker is extremely dependent on is where you are. If you're on a layout, it belongs to a table occurrence, and you can only see related table occurrences. Script runs, it runs on that layout. With ExecuteSQL, you can say, go grab data from somewhere else, and it can do that. And it's just super flexible. Part 2 of this. I wanted to show how simple it is to write these calculations out. I won't spend too much time here, but I do, again, want to prove that this is a doable but magical thing. So we can do something like select, and actually before I do that, let me show you what my data looks like. So now we're actually looking at FileMaker data. And so I've got a list of expenses here. About 1,000 records of expenses. And if we look at the table, kind of here in the middle, you'll see the most important fields, right? We've got some expense data and categories and dollar amounts and so on and so forth. So if I just want to grab some data, now over here, I'm on a resources layout, which is, again, not related to that data. And I can say something like select date expense. And John Austin is going to yell at me for not capitalizing things, for good habit, from expense. And so now I get a bunch of data. And this feels a little underwhelming. You're like, that's cool. I mean, I could just look at the FileMaker side. But this is the starting. This is the building block, right? You start with the 1 + 1, and you move up. So I can look at all that data. I can add more fields. Now show me the sales rep along with it. So now you'll see that. And just so you know, what I'm doing here is I've got a global text field, and then I've got a calculation that's actually running ExecuteSQL, just so I could play with it on the screen. So this is a super basic example. Select these fields from that table. I could add things that are more specific, so I could maybe add category in here. And you'll notice that I like to click out a lot. ExecuteSQL is very finicky. Who's done ExecuteSQL before? It can be a little bit rough, right? So you've got to be cautious, and it takes some futzing with it. So I like to always just build it in chunks so that I'm safe the whole way. So I've got these 3 fields, and I can put in where, right? And a where is a lot like a find. So where the sales rep equals Mary. And so now if you look at the data over here, we've got the Mary data, right? We don't have anybody else in that list. And on top of that, I could do things like, maybe we don't want the expense date. Maybe we just want the sales rep. And then we want to know the dollar amount, and we can group that data now. So we can say group by sales rep. And let me remove the Mary part, otherwise we would just see Mary. And so now, FileMaker is giving me summary data lightning fast. It's 1,000 records, right? I didn't have to create a separate layout to look at this. I didn't need summary fields. I didn't need subsummary parts. It just kind of groups up and chunks up the data for you. This is a great way to find misspellings in your database. You could do one of these. That's not how you spell that. I don't know if you saw the typo police on my thing, but that's one of my things, so I do it all the time. All right, how does this feel? Does this feel doable? Okay, cool. So I definitely say that this is one of those that's baby steps. You try this thing, and it's not going to feel so exciting, but at least something comes back, and then you just keep hoping that question mark doesn't show up. The one I do actually want to show is a join. So a join has kind of 2 pieces to it. It's got the join, it's what table you're joining, and then under that, it's what you're relating by. So if one thing that we have in this table, if you look over here, we've got the client name right here. So the client data lives in a separate table. So we've got clients, and each client can have multiple expenses. So if I go in here and I can say join client, that's the name of the table, and then I say on, and then I say what I'm going to relate it by. So it'll be client.id equals expense dot, and then ID client is the name of my field. Now, I'm actually going to run into a problem here, and this is something that's important to know. If you have tables that have the same field names, and you try to call it without explaining where it's coming from, ExecuteSQL doesn't know what to do, right? The select statement gets confused. And what I do have is I have a sales rep in the client table, And I also have a sales rep in the expense table. The idea being that every client has a default sales rep, but then things change. So if I want to be cautious here, and to make this work, I have to explicitly say that I want the sales rep from expense. I'm going to remove this here for a second. And then I can say, show me the sales rep, show me the client name, and then show me the date of the expense. So there you see Mary, and then instead of seeing just the client ID, which is the only thing that the expense table knows, I can create a relationship on the fly. It has no dependency on the relationships graph. I didn't have to create a relationship for that to work. And now I can get that information, though, just with my ExecuteSQL. All right, so what I want to do next is I've got some pre-baked reports. I've got a few scripts I've already written, and I want to show those off. So here's what kind of a typical script looks like when I'm trying to do some ExecuteSQL. So I'm going to a layout. I like the pipe delimiter. It's easier to read for me instead of a comma. And sometimes your data has commas. So make sure that when you pick your delimiter, whatever it might be, make it as unique as possible. So sometimes you'll see like asterisk, pipe, asterisk. You might see some other, there's a lot of choices there. And then I'm going to set a variable here. And in the first example, I showed a global field that I was using, so I could actually copy and paste something in. Generally speaking, my preference is to use variables because it's one less field I have to create. So I tend to use variables a lot for this kind of thing. And if we look at what that looks like, it's going to look a lot like that last one I wrote. In this case, I'm going to look at the region and the sales rep and see the amount of their expenses. And I'm joining the client by client ID to the ID client and expense, because the region is stored at the client level. So if I want to create this report, I need to make sure I can see that data. When you do some aggregate stuff like this, you need to make sure that you're grouping by a thing. So I'm grouping by the region, and then I'm also grouping by the sales rep. I've got a subscript here that's just going to make sure it takes me to the right found set. That will often refresh the layout, and that would be fine. A refresh window is a really important thing to keep in mind, though, because whenever you change, because it's stored in local memory and it's a little bit different than normal data, you do have to refresh the window to get those fields to update. So if I run that report, again, nothing too fancy here. I've got a table, and there are my two most important fields. The row, which has a number hard-coded into it, right, 1, and so on. And then I have all values, which is getting that report data, that variable I'm setting, that global variable. And then it's, again, making a little mini array. And then I have fields that are grabbing whatever value I want it to get, value 1, 2, or 3. So on the layout itself, I've got my 3 fields. And I've called them very generic things here, just for the sake of the example. Now I'm going to run a very similar script. Really, the only difference has to do with what I'm going to organize by. So I want to group it by sales rep and category. But just for the sake of the example, I wanted to do it with sub-summaries. So you've got sub-summaries showing for this part of the data. Now this may not feel as flashy as it could, because you could do this with the sub-summary report in FileMaker. There's not a lot of data manipulation there. But again, building blocks, right? We got this far, and now we can play with the hammer a little bit differently. Now this is the part where I have to take a very important break and talk about the public service announcement, which is practice safe SQL. SQL is a blob of text and concept, so it's just a bunch of text you put in as part of your function. And if you change a field name, it breaks. If you rename a table, it breaks. If you have a space and you don't treat it properly, it breaks. There's a lot of these little caveats. If it's a reserved word and you don't know it, you're going to get the question mark for a while until you realize that's why it's broken. So there are ways to protect your data, and it's a little frustrating because it makes the code a little bit harder to read, but I want to show you a couple of different ways that you could do it. So this is the same as the one that we just looked at, and here I'm doing it in one variable, and I'm using ExecuteSQL to do it. This is my personal way. This is the way I tend to do it, just because I like to read it this way, but it's not as legible as it is naturally, so there's definitely some adjustment that has to happen. Basically set everything at the top, right? This is what the fields are going to be, this is what the table is going to be, and the group by, and then at the bottom, it puts it all together. So again, a little bit harder to read, but it's still spaced out. And you'll notice that there are some functions there. So there's GTFN and GTN. Now traditionally, I've seen people use GFN for the field name, and it works really well. And what that does is it puts the field name in quotes so that it's safe, so that ExecuteSQL won't have a problem with it if it's a reserved word, if it has a space in it or something like that. But if you remember, one of the things I said was you might run into conflicts when you have the same field in multiple tables, which is the sales rep one realistic? Maybe not. Maybe you could have called it something different. But you might be looking at IDs, right? And a lot of tables have just a field called ID. So what this function does is instead of just getting the field's name, it actually takes the TO name, puts a period, and then puts the field name. And it works really well. I'll take it. And it saves you from having, because I've seen other ways where you'll say get table name and then period and then get field name. So it's just all in one. So this is one way you could protect it. I like the way that this works, but when my SQL breaks, I've now got to copy a whole chunk, put it into the data viewer, do some stuff there, remember to paste it back. It's a little bit harder in the sense of running it through a script. So another way to do it is, I'm following the same model here as that one, that same style. But the difference is that I'm creating the SQL statement. The only thing that comes out of this variable is the blob of text that tells it what to look for. So it'll say something like select date expense from expense. It's that whole thing. It'll just create it for me. It doesn't actually execute it yet. So if we go down here, you'll see that now it's going to look at that variable to actually create it. So when I do that, if I'm running my script debugger, if I look at the data viewer, I can now look at the SQL and see what it's actually doing. I don't get stuck having to guess in the script workspace. And that's where you'll see kind of what those functions are doing. We've got the quotes for the table name, a period, and then the quotes for the field name. Now this last one, Bob Bauer showed me this, and that's how he presented it on training day, and I thought this was really cool too. And we were having a discussion on the illegibility of using these functions sometimes to practice safe SQL. And he showed me this approach, where you have a before and an after. And basically, it's more legible in the top, right? I can read that. I know what I'm doing. But then at the bottom, it actually replaces it the right way. I like this a lot because there are plenty of times when, in the format that I normally use, when I repeat the same thing over and over again, right? So I want to see the sales rep, and I want to group by the sales rep. So I've got to remember to put the sales rep in two different parts of my let statement. With this, I just have to replace it once, and it knows to replace it everywhere. So this is actually super flexible. So maybe I'll hear about that on Monday. I don't know, though. We'll see. All right, so from here on out, I did keep the format that I normally use, just because that's my hammer. But I do urge you to make sure that you do protect your SQL, because there's nothing worse than someone changes a field, you've got a developer in-house, or something happens, and now it just stops working. It's really hard to figure out where things might have gone wrong. One of the things that I love about ExecuteSQL is the ability, and virtual lists, right? Because now we're putting the two together. I like that you can do crosstab reports. In this script right here, let me run it real quick. There we go. So here I'm looking at data both across and down. Now FileMaker generally doesn't like data this way, right? FileMaker is a very down kind of software. But from a reporting standpoint, from management, from a lot of other reasons, it's really great to be able to look at the data this way, right? It's much easier to interpret. So how is this different? There's a few different ways that you could handle this. You can use repeating fields for some of it or for all of it. You lose some sorting functionality that way. I used a repeating field for the columns, but then individual fields for the rest of it. So what do I have? I'm still doing very similar things. I still have a row, right? I have to know which record I'm looking at. I still have an all values so that I can collect my little mini array and then manipulate that. And then I've got different data for different columns. So I do have a separate field for each column here. Now this one is where it gets a little bit crazy because there's some crazy functionality here. There's a custom function that's in here that I also got from Bob. And what it does is you basically have data that's row data and you've got column data. And you tell FileMaker to go match each one of those up and to go find it in the data. So let me show you what the global variables look like. So the report data, which I pulled with ExecuteSQL, I see Jane multiple times because Jane had different types of data, right? She had gifts and she had marketing material and she had other things. But this beginning part tells me what my combination is, right? I want to see Jane and dining. I want to see Jane and entertainment, and so on and so forth. I also have a rows variable that just has what's going to show up on the left-hand side. These are all the choices I have. And then I have columns that tell me what's going to go across the top. One of the limitations, though, with virtual list is that you're creating, if you take this approach, you're creating a field for every column. So it can be a little bit tedious. I wouldn't try to put, I was picky here in that I didn't try to put the categories across the top because it's more variable that way. If I know I have a limited number of salespeople, if I know that I have 12 months in a year, those things are manageable and they're not going to change. So what that, in short, what that function does, and you guys are welcome to parse it apart once I send off the demo files here. What it's really doing is it's saying, go find, in this report data, go find the word Jane, and then my delimiter, which is pipe. Go find Jane, pipe, dining, pipe. Go find that. And so the database hunts for it, and it finds this right here. And then I say, grab the third piece of data from that. That's the column that I care about. And it's dumping that right in there. What's so good about this is that it's protected from data that's missing. So like, let's say that we don't have, Jane didn't have any entertainment sports. Now remember, I can manipulate the data this way because it's just a blob of data, right? It's not looking at my live data. It's taking that information and it's put it in this blob, so I can manipulate it. And if I go in here and refresh the layout, you'll see that that one little block disappears. I have built plenty of solutions the wrong way where that would have moved everything over and then someone's upset because the data's wrong. So it's great that this is always looking for a match, right? Value 1, pipe value 2, pipe, and then it gets that, in this case, it gets me value 3. Does this feel like something you guys could use? Got some good reporting needs for that? And then just to show that, again, I changed tables, and I'll show this just for transparency's sake. I did change tables here. So I have a virtual list, which is where I showed you the very first 2 virtual lists I created, and the clean ones. And then right now I moved to a different one that's called Crosstab because it's got a bit of a different number of fields. It's got a different use. So you might find yourself creating multiple virtual list tables depending on what your needs are and how flexible your data needs to be. So just to show that it is flexible, though, if I've got something that's going to follow a very similar format, I can use something like the Crosstab here. And you'll notice that now, instead of looking at sales reps at the top, I'm now seeing Q data, quarter data, right? So Q1 through Q3, and it's only through the current year, so there's no more data than that. All right, so we started with really simple. Let's create these simple virtual lists. Let's create these simple ExecuteSQLs. We're kind of bumping it up a notch with these other features, right? These other reports. So now we've got to keep going. So I'm going to jump to this one. Now this one takes a little bit more scripting because there are more pieces. It's also the interface that I designed for it. What if I want to do it? What if I want to let my user make their own decisions? It's pretty common. You create a report because someone says, I need a report by quarters. And then they say, oh, while you're at it, and I need a report by category. And then maybe a week later, oh, can you do it by sales rep, right? It's kind of this mounting of reporting that happens. It's nice when you can give your users control, and you can. So again, with virtual lists, you're just collecting data, you're putting it in a blob, and then you're showing it with a virtual list, at least in these cases. So I can ask the user what they want to see at the top, I can ask the user what they want to see on the left, and then I can even do things like the where clause, where the date is between these 2 dates. So if I want to see it by year, we'll do 2017, and by category, there's my data. So there's my 2017, 2018 data on my columns, and on the left-hand side, I've got my categories. Now, when you're developing like this, if you do something like this, again, you're going to have to be cautious about your columns, right? Because if you're going to follow the traditional FileMaker field approach for this and not use something like JavaScript or a web viewer, you are limited by the number of fields you create. But I would say that 80% of the time, you can manipulate the information that way. And again, I can go in here and now just change my information. So maybe I'll switch it back to a single year. And now I'm looking at it grouped by client data. So I can see the client and how much expenses we spent on those clients by quarter. Whenever I prepare these demos for Selenium TV or for presentations like this, I always go, but what else could I do next? Like, what's the next thing? What's the next notch up? And I was thinking through this, and it's the screenshot I showed you. Well, I create these different reports, right? My client says, I need all these variables, and I create it. And then they say, can I just see it all? I have to click 4 times and I'm over it. Sure, absolutely. So I created an all button. So when I click on all, what it's going to do is it's going to create one big table of data. And I can do that because I'm not looking at I'm looking at my real data, but I'm putting it in a blob however I want to, right? So if we look at the data viewer, there's my report data. And you'll see that the information kind of changes, right? So we've got here it's broken down by category. Here it's broken down by client, and so on and so forth. Again, there's some strategy here, right? I didn't let them have differences in the columns, but I think that makes sense from a reporting perspective. So it's a little bit of this is definitely planning on what the right path is so that they don't create some report that maybe doesn't make a lot of sense. But there's definitely some really cool things you can do here. So just to show you what this looks like, there are my fields of data. And what I was going to show you was the script. So these are just scripts to set up that little wizard, that little card window that comes up and put those in, and to make sure you're seeing the right stuff. This is where the magic happens. So it's a little bit longer than my other scripts, just an ooch. And there's some kind of quirky stuff going on here. I'm basically checking to see if I have all select, and if I have all select, then I've got to do something 4 times, so I have a loop for that. And then here, if you remember a couple of the examples I showed you for how to keep your data, how to keep your SQL safe, I didn't really break it out by variable, but here, I'm so dependent on what the user selects that I need a lot of variability. So I have a separate variable for everything, and a lot of case statements and things like that. So it says if the person chose quarter, then you're going to search, that's going to be one of the fields you want from your ExecuteSQL. If they chose year instead, you want that field, and so on and so forth. I'm basically building my SQL query on the fly. And so in this case specifically, I've got the first, because it's a cross tab, I've got my 2 values that I want, right? Whatever the column is, whatever the row is. And then in this case, I've got a single field that shows me that dollar amount in the middle. So I'm looping through this data. I've got some other stuff. I've got some stuff here that only happens sometimes. So for example, I don't always need to be related to client. And I don't want to create a join I don't need, right? We don't want to slow the database down at all, or especially when you're processing data this way. So I have an if statement. If the client chose, if the user chose client or region, you're going to need this join thing. So go ahead and put it in there. So at the end, I basically put everything together in one big list. So I get one big array, which is my text. So if we run this with the script debugger real quick, set some fields, close a window. What I want to show you is what the SQL statement looks like. So you'll see all these things building up over here. And when we get down to the actual SQL, there it is. If I change a single variable, it's going to change next time, right? So if instead of looking, in this case, it's going to the first one, so it's looking by quarter and by category. If I said client, then wherever you see category, you would see client. So this is one of my favorite things with virtual lists, is just empowering the user to have control of their data. They don't need me to create all those different iterations of those reports. I can give them options. I can give them a format so that they can do that themselves. All right, so that's the picker approach. So the very last one I have is about notifications. I have a client, it's a company called Renaissance, and there are 3 phenomenal women developers there who they say, do we jump? And I say, sure. And they say, okay, just tell us how and we'll do it. And it's great. And they're super efficient, and they're really smart, and it's been a really good partnership. So as much as I'm mentoring them, they're actually just running with the advice that I give them. And one of the things they requested was the ability to have notifications. So they needed different people at the company to be able to see invoices that were overdue, or invoices that hadn't been paid, or just a bunch of other different things, right? You can imagine all the kinds of things that you'd like to be alerted about with your data. So what we ended up doing, we did a lot of brainstorming together on how we were going to do this, and ExecuteSQL was the perfect answer for this. One of the benefits of ExecuteSQL is that it runs beautifully on the server, and the server tends to be way faster than your local machine. So with perform script on server, you can push that information. So with them, and it's a simplified version here, but for them, we have it running on a timer. When you open up the certain window, the main menu, a timer runs, and a script runs on the server that grabs a bunch of data, brings it back, and then shows it to the user if they click on the icon. So over here, I've got my little alert icon, and I've got 3 notifications. It tells me that there are 328 where the expenses haven't been paid, $500 or plus that were spent. We have 52 of those, and then there are 5 clients that have really high expenses. And because I can combine ExecuteSQL as a way to collect data, I can mix it with FileMaker to find that data when the user wants it. So if I click on expenses not yet paid, now my found set changes to that same number, right, 328 records. And when I click here and they say 500 plus, now I'm looking at the 52 records that match that. It doesn't have to stay on this layout, right? It's a FileMaker script. I can make it do whatever it wants, wherever it wants. And then that last one's a little bit different. That one says 5 because there are 5 clients. In this case, I chose to show all of the related expenses so that you knew what you were looking at. So if we scroll through this, you'll end up seeing 5 sub-summary sections that tell you how much each one of these clients spent. From a programming perspective, I have an update notification script, and what it does is it runs a specific script depending on the scenario. So in this case, I have 3 different types of alerts or notifications that I can get. I might have 10 or 20. I think my client has upwards of 10. And so it goes out, it does some logic. I need to go get some ExecuteSQL. Again, it's specific to the user, so now you can be specific and say, if you're a sales rep, you get these 5 notifications. If you're admin, you get all of them, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of flexibility here. Again, we're dealing with FileMaker and scripting. So I collect information, and let me just show you what the actual scripts look like. They're really short. So I've got the description, what I want it to show, and then I've got the data, which is what it's actually grabbing the information. And the cool thing about this is that I really don't need to pull a lot of data. I'm mostly just grabbing the count, right? Because I just want to know how many of these were a problem. So I want to see that full number there. And then I exit the script with the name and then that data. And then I didn't want to have to reference that whole long description because my client's probably going to change their mind because I would. So I wanted to create a type or a field that was shorter so that it was kind of my code word for that thing, right? So in this case, I called this one unpaid. So those 3 things run. It then opens up a card window. It takes me to a virtual list, just like the other examples. And it shows me a small window of just those notifications that applied, right, the ones that came back with results. And then when you click on any of those, then you've got this view notifications, and here's where you'll see my code words. Each one of those, I'm not showing it on the virtual list, but it's the 3rd field that gets pulled. And on that one, I can look at the type, and then I can say, okay, because you clicked on the unpaid one, go run this script. And now we're solely talking FileMaker. So it feels a little repetitious because you're basically doing it the ExecuteSQL way, and then you're doing it the data way. But you need them for different reasons. And it gives my user what they need. So here in this case, this is a simple one where we're just looking at the flag paid to know if it belongs in that list or not. What do you think? Cool stuff? All right, so virtual lists, very important. They do not require ExecuteSQL to gather data. Sometimes ExecuteSQL is not the right answer. It's kind of a trial and error. There's a lot of things, where looping through a found set might work really well. Because, again, ExecuteSQL is not context, doesn't care about context or your found set. So it might be better to just loop through records or use the list of summary field. Virtual lists are specific to the user and their session. And virtual lists do not represent live data. And this is often okay because you're not looking at seconds of difference. If you've got a business where transactions are happening every second, a virtual list is going to be behind depending on how often you update the data. Because again, you've taken that live data and you've put a blob of it somewhere else. So you need to update your data often to be able to have it be up to date. ExecuteSQL, it returns an array of data, returned a limited list, or of single value sometimes. It's another way to gather and group data. It's got built-in summarizing capabilities, which is awesome. And it is phenomenal with perform script on server. That first one, it catches me every time I make a virtual list, which is I forget to unstore my all values, and then it doesn't update, so that's probably what that is if it happens. You do want to remember that we are bound by our records. So if you saw I created 1,000 records at the beginning, let's say that I had 1,001 rows in my data, it would cut off that 1. It just wouldn't exist. They wouldn't know that it was there. So one thing you can do is protect your scripts and say, how many rows of data do I have? And do I have that many in my table? And then you can update it if you need to. Or you build 10,000 records and hope that's good enough. Hard-coded SQL is scary and dangerous, so practice your safe SQL here. It helps to have those functions. The functions make it a lot easier and it is completely a safe approach there. You're dealing with FileMaker functions that update field names and things like that, so it's definitely the right way to do it. Focus on your delimiters. Again, using a comma might not be a good idea. You've got to be careful when your data has returns and things like that, so make sure you know what kind of data you're looking at. And make sure that you always keep your records in your table. So make sure that when you have accounts set up, make sure that they are not allowed to delete data from that table, or add new records, actually, unless you want to do it through a script. All right. Now you guys are going to go make some virtual lists in ExecuteSQL, right? Great. All right. Well, I would love to hear any questions. There are 2 mics, if anybody has any.
Sorry, I was just curious. I'm not sure if this was covered. I might have missed it. But if you have a field or table with spaces in it, how would you overcome that?
A field or table. So the functions that I have in there, the GTFN and GFN, those will protect against it. What it does is it puts double quotes around it. Okay. And that's how it gets protected.
Just curious if all the new JSON stuff, has that changed your hammer at all in how you do things?
I'm not ready to let go of that hammer yet. I think JSON is awesome and excellent, and I think it's another good approach. It's another way to collect data, it's another way to handle data, and it's a very standard way to get data. So I think it's important to know that hammer, but you're going to have to pry this one out for now.
Hey, Martha.
Hello.
I noticed you had some custom functions that you use to format your field names when you're trying to make it so that they're SQL safe. Mm-hmm. I've done that, and I've used getFieldName, but unfortunately getFieldName relies on context as well in order to process properly. How do you get around that?
So the time that it causes problems is when you have it in a calculation, because calculations are context specific based on the table. I tend to avoid having ExecuteSQL stored in any form in a field, and it has other implications too. In a script, though, it actually doesn't look at that. So even if you're on a layout that isn't related to, say, the expenses table, the function itself will still calculate what the table name is and what the field name is. So in a script, it'll actually work.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Is there any reason you couldn't use a repetition field?
Repeating fields don't sort well, or you can't summarize them as well. There's limitations on how that works. I like them to use them in the header so that I have one big header field. Honestly, I ran into some issues a few years back, and I got some weird performance stuff. Maybe it wasn't that, but it kind of got stuck in my brain. So I tend to like the separate fields.
This is more a suggestion than a question. The safe SQL approaches, their built-in drawback, even as you gain, you lose, is it's a much more complex expression.
Yes.
Takes more time to create, takes more time to edit, more chance for user error putting it together. So the next step where you can take this, that some of us are doing, is we type in just the simple SQL query, and we let FileMaker expand it into the complex one. So that would be like your next step in what you've been showing us.
Okay, cool, I like that. And I think everybody should submit FileMaker feedback and let them know that we would really like that to be built in. All right, I will be uploading the demo files that I have. Thank you everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your DevCon.